The hardest thing about telling the truth is discovering that the people you love have already decided you are lying. I still remember the exact moment my parents stopped believing me because it did not happen inside a courtroom or during a police interview. It happened around our own dinner table on a rainy Thursday evening nearly 4 years earlier. My father, Michael Carter, sat quietly at the end of the table with his hands folded together while my mother, Linda, stared at me as though she no longer recognized the son she had raised. My older sister, Sarah, avoided looking in my direction altogether. I had spent nearly an hour trying to explain what had actually happened, repeating every detail exactly as I remembered it, hoping that if I stayed calm long enough someone would finally hear the truth instead of the rumors that had spread through our town. Instead, my father slowly shook his head and said something I have never forgotten. "Nathan, sometimes the truth is difficult to hear, but it is still the truth." I looked directly at him and answered, "That is exactly what I have been trying to tell you." He sighed heavily before replying, "No, you are trying to convince us that everyone else is wrong." That sentence ended the conversation before anyone even left the table. I realized then that my family had already reached a conclusion long before asking me any real questions. They believed newspaper headlines, neighborhood gossip, and the opinions of strangers more than the words coming from their own son. I wanted to be angry, but what I felt instead was something much heavier. It was disappointment. I had always believed that family was supposed to be the place where people listened first and judged later. Somehow our family had done exactly the opposite. During the weeks that followed, life became strangely quiet. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors who used to wave across the street suddenly found reasons to look the other way. Invitations disappeared. Conversations became awkward whenever I entered a room. Although I had never been convicted of anything, many people behaved as though the verdict had already been delivered. My parents rarely asked how I was doing. Every discussion eventually returned to the same question. Why can you not simply admit what happened? Each time I answered with the same calm voice. Because what everyone believes is not what actually happened. They never argued loudly. In many ways that made it hurt even more. They simply looked at me with tired expressions that suggested they wished I would stop insisting on a version of events they believed could not possibly be true. A few months later, I packed my belongings into my old pickup truck and moved into a small apartment across town. My mother hugged me before I left, but the embrace felt uncertain. My father carried one of my boxes down the front steps without saying very much. Just before I climbed into the truck, he looked at me and quietly said, "When you are ready to tell us the truth, you know where to find us." I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell him that I had never stopped telling the truth. Instead, I nodded politely, closed the door, and drove away. Sometimes there is no point continuing a conversation with someone who has already decided not to hear you. The next several years became the loneliest period of my life, but they also became the years that changed me the most. I focused on rebuilding everything one step at a time. I found steady work with a regional logistics company where nobody knew my past. I kept my head down, worked hard, treated people with respect, and slowly earned opportunities that had nothing to do with reputation and everything to do with consistency. My coworkers judged me by my actions instead of old stories, and that simple difference reminded me that life could still move forward even when the people closest to me remained stuck in yesterday. I spoke with my parents only on birthdays, holidays, and the occasional family gathering. Those conversations stayed polite but distant. My father always asked how work was going. My mother always asked whether I was taking care of myself. Neither of them ever mentioned the case directly, but I could feel it sitting silently between every sentence we exchanged. It was like an invisible chair at every family dinner, occupying more space than any person actually present. Then one Monday morning, everything changed. I was sitting at my desk reviewing transportation reports when my phone rang. The number belonged to Daniel Brooks, the attorney who had represented me years earlier. We had spoken only a handful of times since everything happened, so I immediately sensed something was different. I answered the call, and before I could say more than hello, Daniel spoke with unusual excitement. "Nathan, I need you to sit down if you are not already sitting." My heart immediately began racing. "What happened?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "New evidence has been officially accepted. The court has approved a full review of your case." For several seconds I could not say anything. I simply stared through the window beside my desk as traffic moved normally below, completely unaware that my entire world had just shifted. Daniel continued explaining that recently recovered digital records and testimony from a newly identified witness had raised serious questions about everything the original investigation had concluded. The review would not happen overnight, but for the first time in years, the legal system was willing to examine every fact again. After ending the call, I remained motionless, trying to understand what this could mean. It was not only an opportunity to clear my name. It was an opportunity to finally place the truth where everyone could see it instead of where only I had carried it for years. That evening, I drove home wondering whether I should tell my parents. Before I could make a decision, my phone rang again. This time it was my father. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Nathan," he said quietly, "your mother and I heard there is going to be another court hearing. Is it true?" I looked out across the parking lot as the sun slowly disappeared behind the buildings. "Yes," I answered. "It is true." There was another long silence before he finally spoke again. "Then your mother and I will be there." I closed my eyes for just a moment because I had no idea whether they were coming to support me or to watch me lose one final time. Nearly 3 weeks later, I parked my pickup truck across the street from the county courthouse just after 8 o'clock on a cool Monday morning. The building looked exactly the way I remembered it from years before, with its tall stone columns, polished glass doors, and the American flag moving gently in the morning breeze. The difference was not the courthouse. The difference was me. For years earlier, I had walked through those doors hoping someone would believe me. This time I walked in carrying something stronger than hope. I carried evidence that had survived long enough to speak for itself. My attorney, Daniel Brooks, was already waiting near the security entrance with a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. He smiled as I approached and extended his hand. "Good morning, Nathan." I shook it firmly. "How are you feeling?" he asked. I thought for a moment before answering honestly. "Calmer than I expected." He nodded approvingly. "That is good. Today is not about proving how emotional you are. Today is about letting the facts do their job." We passed through security, collected our belongings, and walked together toward the courtroom. The hallway felt strangely familiar. Lawyers moved quickly between offices carrying files. Court employees greeted one another with quiet professionalism. Families waited on wooden benches, each carrying worries that nobody else could fully understand. Everyone had a story. Mine simply happened to be returning after nearly 4 years. As we reached the courtroom doors, Daniel stopped walking. "Before we go inside," he said quietly, "I want you to remember something. We are not asking anyone for sympathy. We are asking them to examine evidence that was never properly examined before. That is an important difference." I nodded. "I understand." He smiled. "Good. Let the truth stay simple." We entered the courtroom together. The room was already beginning to fill with attorneys, court staff, reporters from 2 local newspapers, and several members of the public who had followed the original case years earlier. I recognized a few faces immediately. Some looked surprised to see me. Others looked curious. I could almost hear the silent questions forming in their minds. Why was the case back? What had changed? Was there really something everyone had missed? I took my seat beside Daniel without saying a word. A few minutes later, the courtroom doors opened again. My parents walked inside together. My father wore the same navy blue suit he reserved for weddings and funerals. My mother walked quietly beside him, holding her purse with both hands. They looked around the room until they found me. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then my father gave a small nod before leading my mother toward the public seating area behind us. They did not come over to speak. They simply sat down together, leaving 2 empty seats between themselves and the next family. I understood why. None of us knew what today would bring. A few moments later, I noticed my older sister, Sarah, entering through another doorway. She looked uncertain as she spotted our parents before finally taking the seat beside our mother. She glanced toward me briefly and offered a polite smile. It was the first smile I had received from her in years. It was small, almost hesitant, but it was enough to tell me she was no longer completely certain about everything she once believed. The courtroom gradually became quiet as the judge entered. Everyone stood before taking their seats again. Judge Rebecca Collins looked around the room with calm professionalism before opening the hearing. She explained that the purpose of the proceeding was to review newly admitted evidence that had not been available during the original investigation. Her voice remained measured and precise, reminding everyone that today's hearing was about facts rather than assumptions. I appreciated those words more than anyone in the room probably realized. Daniel quietly organized his documents while the opposing attorneys prepared their own files. The first portion of the hearing focused on procedural matters. New digital records had recently been recovered from archived computer systems that were unavailable years earlier due to technical limitations. Additional documentation had also been verified through independent forensic analysis. None of it proved everything by itself, but together the materials raised serious questions about conclusions that had once appeared certain. I remained completely silent while the attorneys discussed timelines, authentication procedures, and evidentiary standards. There was no dramatic confrontation. There did not need to be. Every carefully presented fact quietly weakened the certainty that had surrounded the original case. During a brief recess, Daniel leaned toward me. "Have you looked behind you?" he whispered. I slowly turned my head. My parents were speaking softly with Sarah. My father no longer looked confident. Instead, he appeared deeply focused on every document placed before the court. My mother held a notebook in her lap, writing down dates and details exactly as they were presented. Neither of them looked at me. They were finally looking at the evidence. When the hearing resumed, the court clerk introduced the first newly admitted exhibit. It was a collection of digital records that established a timeline inconsistent with several assumptions made years earlier. The courtroom remained completely silent as each document appeared on the courtroom monitors. Dates matched. Timestamps aligned. Independent verification confirmed the records had not been altered. Daniel stood and calmly explained how those records supported the account I had given from the very beginning. He never raised his voice. He simply allowed each piece of evidence to connect naturally with the next. I glanced briefly toward the gallery once more. My father had stopped taking notes. He was staring at the screen with an expression I had never seen before. It was not disbelief. It was uncertainty. For the first time in 4 years, I realized he was no longer defending the story he had accepted. He was beginning to question it. Then Judge Collins looked toward both legal teams and announced that after the lunch recess the court would hear testimony from a newly identified witness whose statement had never been included in the original proceedings, and according to Daniel, that testimony had the potential to change everything. After the lunch recess, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt noticeably different. Conversations that had quietly filled the hallways only minutes earlier disappeared as everyone returned to their seats. Reporters opened fresh notebooks. Attorneys organized new exhibits across their tables. Even the spectators seemed to sense that the afternoon would determine whether the morning's questions became genuine answers. I sat beside Daniel Brooks, watching the courtroom doors without speaking. My parents returned to the same seats behind me. My father no longer carried the confident expression he had worn when he first entered the building. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on his knees as though he did not want to miss a single word. My mother quietly folded her hands together while my sister Sarah looked toward the witness stand with quiet anticipation. Judge Rebecca Collins entered the courtroom, and everyone stood before taking their seats again. After reviewing several procedural matters, she looked toward the clerk. "Please call the next witness." The courtroom doors opened, and Detective Emily Harris walked calmly toward the witness stand. Although she had not been assigned to the original investigation, she had recently been appointed to review archived evidence after previously unavailable digital records had been recovered. She took the oath, settled into the witness chair, and answered the first series of questions with calm professionalism. Daniel began carefully. "Detective Harris, could you explain your role in the review of this case?" She nodded. "I was assigned to conduct an independent examination of newly recovered electronic records and supporting documentation that had not been available during the original proceedings." "Did your review include comparing those records with the original investigative timeline?" "Yes." "And what did you discover?" The detective opened a folder before answering. Several important events occurred in a sequence that differed from the timeline accepted during the original investigation. Those differences significantly affected how certain conclusions had been reached. The courtroom remained completely silent. Daniel continued without raising his voice. "Were those differences based on opinions?" "No," Detective Harris replied. "They were based on authenticated digital records, verified communication logs, and independently confirmed timestamps." One by one, documents appeared on the courtroom monitors. Each exhibit established another piece of the timeline. Telephone records confirmed exact call times. Archived electronic logs verified when information had been entered into secure systems. Independent forensic specialists had authenticated every record before it was admitted into evidence. None of the documents relied on memory alone. They relied on information that could be measured, verified, and repeated. Daniel stepped toward the display. Detective Harris, based on these authenticated records, did Mr. Nathan Carter consistently describe this sequence of events from the beginning? She answered without hesitation. Yes. His account remained materially consistent with the evidence that is now available. I heard someone quietly exhale somewhere behind me. I did not need to turn around to know it had come from my parents' section of the courtroom. For years they had listened to people describe my version of events as an excuse. Now an experienced investigator was explaining that the objective evidence matched what I had said all along. The opposing attorney stood for cross-examination. He remained respectful but carefully questioned every detail regarding the recovered records, their preservation, and the verification process. Detective Harris answered each question directly, explaining the technical procedures used to confirm authenticity. Nothing in her testimony sounded exaggerated. She acknowledged the limitations of the original investigation while emphasizing that technology available today had made recovery of certain archived data possible for the first time. Her credibility came not from dramatic statements, but from careful precision. After nearly an hour of testimony, Judge Collins admitted several additional exhibits into the record. Daniel quietly leaned toward me and whispered, "This is going exactly as we hoped." I nodded but remained focused. I had learned years earlier not to celebrate before the entire story had been told. The next witness entered shortly afterward. His name was Thomas Reynolds, a retired information technology administrator who had previously worked for the organization responsible for maintaining several archived electronic systems connected to the case. During the original proceedings, those systems had been believed to contain incomplete data because of storage limitations. Recent restoration efforts had unexpectedly recovered complete archival records. Daniel approached the witness stand once again. "Mr. Reynolds, were you involved in restoring the archived system reviewed by Detective Harris?" "Yes, I supervised the restoration project." "Did that project recover records previously believed to be unavailable?" "It did." "And were those recovered records independently verified before being released to investigators?" "Yes." Multiple verification procedures confirmed that the records had not been altered. Another series of exhibits appeared on the courtroom screens. Thomas carefully explained how the archived information preserved automatic timestamps that could not be manually edited after they were originally created. Those records established a sequence of events that directly supported the account I had consistently maintained for 4 years. More importantly, they demonstrated that several assumptions accepted during the original investigation had been based on incomplete information rather than intentional wrongdoing by investigators. I slowly turned my head toward the gallery. My father was staring at the evidence with his notebook resting unopened beside him. He was no longer writing because there was nothing left to interpret. He was simply watching facts unfold one after another. My mother gently covered her mouth with one hand as another authenticated record appeared on the screen. Sarah lowered her eyes briefly before looking back toward the witness stand. Nobody in my family looked angry anymore. They looked overwhelmed. Daniel concluded his questioning with one final point. "Mr. Reynolds, based on the restored records now before the court, would it have been possible for Mr. Carter to have known these technical details when he first gave his original statement several years ago?" Thomas answered firmly, "No. These archived records were not recoverable at that time. The only way his original account could match the restored timeline is if he had accurately described what actually happened." Those words settled over the courtroom with a weight that no dramatic argument could ever equal. They were simple, factual, and impossible to ignore. Judge Collins reviewed several notes before looking toward both legal teams. "The court will continue tomorrow morning with additional testimony, including the presentation of evidence recently provided by an independent eyewitness whose statement has never before been heard in these proceedings." As the hearing adjourned for the day, I remained seated for a moment while everyone slowly began leaving the courtroom. I could hear quiet conversations filling the room once again, but one sentence spoken softly behind me captured my attention more than anything else. It was my father, and for the first time in 4 years, I heard uncertainty in his voice as he quietly asked my mother, "What if Nathan has been telling us the truth from the very beginning?" The following morning, I arrived at the courthouse nearly 30 minutes earlier than necessary, not because I expected anything dramatic to happen before the hearing began, but because I wanted a few quiet moments to gather my thoughts. The previous day had changed the direction of the case in ways I had not allowed myself to imagine for years. Facts that had remained hidden inside forgotten computer archives were finally being seen by everyone in the courtroom, including the people whose opinions had mattered most to me. As I walked through the front entrance, I noticed familiar faces from the day before. Reporters stood near the hallway discussing the latest developments in low voices. Attorneys reviewed legal documents while court staff moved efficiently from one office to another. The building felt busy, but there was also a quiet sense of anticipation. Everyone understood that the evidence presented so far had raised serious questions, and many believed today's testimony could answer them. Daniel Brooks greeted me outside the courtroom with a cup of coffee already waiting in his hand. "You look like you slept better," he said with a slight smile. "A little," I admitted. "I also know there is still a long way to go." He nodded. "That is exactly the attitude you should have. Yesterday established credibility. Today establishes the complete picture." We entered the courtroom together. My parents were already seated behind us. My father looked tired, as though he had spent much of the night thinking instead of sleeping. My mother offered me a small smile as I walked past. It was not the warm smile I remembered from childhood, but it was different from the guarded expression she had worn for years. It carried uncertainty, compassion, and perhaps the beginning of hope. Sarah quietly nodded in my direction before returning her attention to the documents resting in her lap. Judge Rebecca Collins entered promptly at 9 o'clock, and the proceedings began without delay. After addressing several administrative matters, she instructed the clerk to call the next witness. A woman in her early 40s walked calmly toward the witness stand. Her name was Jennifer Wallace. I recognized her immediately, even though we had not spoken in years. At the time of the original events, she had worked for a neighboring company located in the same office complex where several key events had taken place. Back then, investigators had never interviewed her because nobody realized she had information relevant to the timeline. Only during the recent review had Detective Emily Harris discovered archived visitor records placing Jennifer at the location on the exact day in question. After taking the oath, Jennifer answered Daniel's first questions with quiet confidence. She explained that she had recently been contacted after investigators compared restored electronic access records with employee schedules preserved by her former company. Until then, she had never realized that what she witnessed that day could matter years later. Daniel asked her to describe everything she remembered. Jennifer spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully. She explained that she had been leaving a conference room shortly after finishing a client meeting when she noticed activity near the hallway connected to the offices involved in the original investigation. She remembered checking the time on her phone because she was running late for another appointment across town. That detail, insignificant at the time, became critically important because the phone records preserved the exact minute she left the building. She then described seeing me walking calmly toward the parking lot several minutes before a sequence of events that had later been interpreted very differently. Daniel displayed a timeline on the courtroom monitor. Jennifer reviewed each time entry before confirming that it accurately reflected her recollection. The opposing attorney questioned her memory respectfully, asking how she could remain confident after so many years. Jennifer answered with remarkable honesty. "I do not remember every detail from that day," she admitted. "What I remember clearly are the things connected to my own schedule, because I was worried about being late. When investigators showed me the restored electronic records and my calendar entries, they match what I remembered. That helped me understand why the timing mattered." Her answer carried weight because it sounded natural rather than rehearsed. She acknowledged ordinary human limitations while explaining why certain moments had remained memorable. Daniel then introduced additional evidence supporting her testimony. Security access records, parking garage entry logs, and archived visitor registrations all confirmed her location and timing. One by one, independent sources aligned with her account. There was no single dramatic piece of evidence. Instead, dozens of ordinary records created a consistent pattern that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Judge Collins carefully reviewed each exhibit before admitting it into the official record. I glanced behind me for only a moment. My father was no longer simply listening. He was studying every exhibit as though trying to understand how so many overlooked details had remained hidden for years. My mother's eyes filled with quiet emotion as Jennifer continued describing the ordinary afternoon that had unknowingly become part of a much larger story. Sarah looked toward me briefly before lowering her eyes again. I could almost see each new document reshaping memories my family had carried for years. After Jennifer completed her testimony, Detective Emily Harris returned briefly to explain how the independent records from multiple organizations had been compared during the renewed investigation. She described the review process in clear, straightforward language, emphasizing that investigators intentionally sought information from unrelated sources to eliminate the possibility of error. Every verified record strengthened the reliability of the reconstructed timeline. Daniel asked one final question. Detective Harris, after reviewing every authenticated record now before the court, have you reached a professional conclusion regarding the consistency of Mr. Carter's original statements? She answered without hesitation. Yes. His original account is consistent with every independently verified record recovered during this review. The evidence supports his description of events rather than the assumptions that guided the original investigation. Those words settled quietly across the courtroom. Nobody reacted dramatically because there was no need. The evidence had reached a point where it spoke more clearly than any emotional argument ever could. Judge Collins reviewed her notes for several moments before addressing both legal teams. She explained that the court had now received substantial corroborating evidence from independent sources and that the final phase of the proceedings would focus on legal conclusions drawn from the complete record. As the morning session ended, people slowly stood and began leaving their seats. Before I could gather my papers, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I turned and found my father standing only a few feet away. He looked at me for several seconds without speaking. Finally, in a voice quieter than I had ever heard from him, he said, "Nathan, I think there are some things your mother and I need to understand before this is over." My father remained standing in front of me for several long seconds, as though he was searching for words that refused to come easily. The hallway outside the courtroom had become busy with attorneys, reporters, and families discussing everything they had just witnessed, yet for a brief moment it felt as though none of those conversations existed. My mother slowly walked over and stood beside him while Sarah remained a few steps behind. Nobody spoke immediately, for years of silence had taught all of us that conversations could not simply be rushed. Finally, my father took a slow breath. "Nathan," he said quietly, "I think I owe you something, but I also think I should wait until all of this is finished." I looked at him without anger. "That is probably the right decision," I answered. "Let everything be heard first." He nodded, almost with relief, and my mother gently touched his arm before the court clerk announced that everyone should return to the courtroom. We quietly walked back inside and took our seats once again. The afternoon session focused less on introducing new evidence and more on connecting everything that had already been presented. Daniel Brooks stood before the court with several binders neatly arranged across the counsel table. He spoke with the same calm confidence that had carried us through every stage of the hearing. Rather than relying on dramatic language, he carefully guided the court through the complete timeline one final time. Beginning with the earliest documented events, he matched every significant moment to independently verified records that had now been admitted into evidence. Digital communication logs confirmed exact times. Security access records established locations. Parking garage entries, archived visitor registrations, electronic system data, and witness testimony all pointed toward the same conclusion. Individually, each document answered only a small question. Together, they formed a complete picture that left very little room for doubt. Daniel paused before the final section of his presentation. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "this matter is no longer supported by assumptions or conflicting memories. We now have multiple independent sources confirming that Mr. Nathan Carter consistently described these events accurately from the very beginning. The evidence available today demonstrates that the original conclusions were based upon incomplete information rather than the complete factual record." The courtroom remained completely still. The opposing attorney rose and presented his closing response with professionalism and respect. He acknowledged that the newly recovered evidence substantially changed the factual understanding of the case. He also explained that the original investigation had been conducted using the information available at that time and that no misconduct had been alleged against those investigators. Judge Rebecca Collins listened carefully to both sides before asking several thoughtful questions about the relationship between the recovered records and the legal findings reached years earlier. Both attorneys answered directly, and once again the supporting documentation consistently pointed in the same direction. After reviewing several final exhibits, Judge Collins quietly closed her notebook and looked across the courtroom. Her expression remained composed as she began delivering the court's findings. She explained that the judicial system depended upon reliable evidence, and that courts also carried the responsibility of correcting decisions whenever significant new facts became available. She carefully summarized the testimony presented over the previous 2 days, noting the remarkable consistency between the newly authenticated records, independent witness testimony, and the original statements I had given years earlier. Every sentence she spoke seemed to remove another layer of misunderstanding that had surrounded my life for so long. Then came the words I had imagined hearing countless times without ever believing they would actually arrive. Judge Collins concluded that the newly admitted evidence fundamentally changed the factual basis of the original findings and fully supported my account of the events under review. She formally entered the court's decision recognizing that my previous statements had been consistently accurate and that the earlier conclusions could no longer stand in light of the complete evidentiary record. For several moments after she finished speaking, the courtroom remained completely silent. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. The quiet itself carried more meaning than any dramatic reaction ever could. I slowly released a breath that I felt I had been holding for 4 years. Daniel leaned toward me and extended his hand. "Congratulations," he said softly. The truth finally had the chance to catch up. I shook his hand firmly, unable to find the right words. Around us, people began gathering their papers and quietly leaving the courtroom. Reporters spoke with attorneys near the doorway while court staff organized the official record. Everything seemed strangely ordinary considering how completely my life had just changed. I remained seated for another moment before standing. As I turned, I found my parents waiting quietly a short distance away. Neither of them moved immediately. My father looked older than I remembered only a few days earlier. The confidence that had once defined every conversation we shared had been replaced by humility. My mother wiped a tear from the corner of her eye before meeting my gaze. Sarah stood silently beside them, looking both relieved and deeply reflective. My father slowly walked toward me until we stood face to face. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Nathan," he said, "I spent 4 years believing I was teaching my son to accept responsibility. Today I realized that I was the one who refused to accept the possibility that I could be wrong." I remained silent, allowing him to continue. I told myself I was being practical. I believed I was following the evidence. But the truth is that I stopped listening to my own son before I ever looked closely enough at the facts. I thought I was protecting our family from disappointment. Instead, I became part of the disappointment. My mother stepped beside him. Tears rested quietly in her eyes as she reached for my hand. "Every birthday," she whispered. "Every holiday, every phone call. I kept hoping you would finally admit something that never happened. I asked the wrong questions because I believed the wrong story. I am so sorry." I looked at both of them for several long seconds. The pain of the past 4 years did not disappear simply because a judge had spoken a few minutes earlier. Those years could never be returned. Missed family dinners, quiet holidays, lonely birthdays, and countless unanswered conversations had become permanent parts of our lives. Yet as I stood there looking at my parents, I realized something equally important. The court had restored my name, but only we could decide whether our family would restore our relationship. I took a slow breath and quietly answered, "The truth has finally been heard. Now we have to decide what we do with it." We left the courthouse together, but nobody seemed to know where to walk first. Reporters remained near the front steps speaking quietly with attorneys while families gathered around loved ones whose cases had also concluded that afternoon. The bright afternoon sun felt strangely unfamiliar after spending 2 days inside the courtroom. Daniel Brooks shook my hand one final time before leaving. "Nathan," he said, The legal process is finished. What happens next belongs to you." I thanked him sincerely and watched as he disappeared into the crowd. My parents remained standing several feet away, waiting patiently instead of assuming they had the right to follow me. That simple gesture meant more than they probably realized. For the first time in years, they were allowing me to decide what happened next. I looked toward them and quietly said, "There is a diner a few blocks from here. If you would like to talk, we can go there." My father nodded immediately. "We would appreciate that." 20 minutes later, we sat inside a small family restaurant that overlooked the town square. It was the kind of place where people ordered homemade pie after lunch, and the servers remembered regular customers by name. The waitress brought coffee for everyone, and then quietly walked away after sensing that our table needed privacy more than conversation. For several moments, nobody reached for the menus. My father finally folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "Nathan," he said, "I have practiced this conversation in my head all afternoon, but none of the words seemed good enough." I answered calmly, "Then do not try to. Make them perfect. Just make them honest." He lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking again. "When everything first happened, I believed I was protecting this family by accepting what seemed to be the most reasonable explanation. I convinced myself that believing everyone else instead of my own son was somehow the responsible thing to do. Every time you insisted you were telling the truth, I told myself that I was being realistic. Looking back now, I realize I stopped being your father and started acting like a judge." My mother quietly wiped another tear from her cheek. "I kept waiting for you to change your story," she admitted softly. "Every birthday card I mailed, every holiday dinner I invited you to, I secretly hoped you would finally tell me something different. I never considered that you had already told me everything I needed to hear." Sarah looked down at her coffee before finally speaking for the first time since we sat down. "I followed Mom and Dad because I trusted them," she said. "I never stopped to ask myself whether I had actually listened to you. I am ashamed of that. I listened without interrupting because I had imagined this conversation many times over the years. I had once imagined feeling satisfaction if my family ever admitted they were wrong. Instead, I felt something much quieter. I felt tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally exhausted from carrying years of loneliness that could never simply disappear because the truth had finally been recognized." I looked at my father and answered carefully, "Do you know what hurt the most?" He slowly shook his head. It was not losing friends. It was not hearing rumors. It was not even sitting in court. The hardest part was realizing that every time I walked into this room with my own family, I felt like I had to defend my existence instead of simply being your son. Nobody spoke. I continued quietly. "Every holiday, I watched all of you have conversations while wondering whether anyone actually believed a single word I said. Every phone call ended with the feeling that I had failed another test I never agreed to take. I kept hoping one of you would ask, 'Nathan, tell us exactly what happened.' Instead, everyone kept asking, 'When are you finally going to admit it?' Those are two completely different questions." My father slowly covered his face with one hand before looking back at me. "You are right," he whispered. "We never gave you the chance to explain because we believed we already knew the answer." My mother reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. "Can you ever forgive us?" she asked quietly. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "Forgiveness is not the difficult part." All three of them looked at me with surprise. "Trust is harder," I continued. "Forgiveness is something I can choose today. Trust is something we build over time. It cannot be repaired in one conversation because it was not broken in one conversation." My father nodded slowly. "That is fair." We sat together for a long time after that, talking about ordinary things we had not shared in years. My parents asked about my job at the logistics company. I told them about the co-workers who had become friends, the promotion I had earned the previous year, and the apartment I had slowly turned into a comfortable home. My mother seemed surprised by how much of my life she had missed. My father listened carefully every time I described another milestone that had happened without my family beside me. There was no bitterness in my voice. There was simply history. Eventually, my father smiled faintly and said, "I spent 4 years believing your life had stopped. Today I learned that you kept moving forward even while carrying all of this." I smiled for the first time that afternoon. I had to. Life does not wait for people to catch up with the truth. As we finished our coffee, the conversation became lighter than any we had shared in years. Nobody pretended the past had disappeared. Nobody tried to erase painful memories with cheerful words. Instead, we acknowledged that healing would require patience, honesty, and consistency. When we finally stood to leave the restaurant, my father placed his hand gently on my shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it reminded me of childhood afternoons when he taught me how to ride a bicycle or throw a baseball in our backyard. For the first time in years, that familiar gesture no longer felt distant. It felt genuine. As we stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight, I realized that the courtroom had restored my reputation, but this quiet conversation around a diner table had begun restoring something even more valuable. It had given our family the chance to become honest with one another again. The weeks that followed did not erase the past, but they slowly changed the direction of our future. Nobody in my family expected trust to return overnight, and I appreciated that more than they probably realized. Instead of making grand promises, my parents chose something much more meaningful. They became consistent. My father began calling every Sunday afternoon, not to revisit the court case or apologize again, but simply to ask how my week had gone. Sometimes we talked about work. Sometimes we discussed football scores or the weather. Other times we laughed about memories from when I was a child. Those conversations were ordinary, yet they carried extraordinary meaning because they were finally free from suspicion. My mother started sending me recipes she thought I might enjoy making at home. Every message ended the same way. I hope you are taking care of yourself. Years earlier, those words had felt distant because I always wondered whether she truly believed in me. Now they sounded sincere again. Sarah also reached out more often. One Saturday morning, she invited me to help her paint the spare bedroom in the house she had recently purchased. As we worked side by side, she quietly admitted something that had stayed on her mind ever since the court hearing. "Nathan," she said while carefully rolling fresh paint across the wall, "I spent years believing that loyalty meant agreeing with everyone else in the family. I finally realized that real loyalty sometimes means asking difficult questions before reaching conclusions." I smiled and continued painting. "We all learn something," I answered. "Some lessons simply cost more than others." She nodded thoughtfully before changing the subject, and I appreciated that she did not force the conversation to become emotional. Healing often happened during ordinary moments rather than dramatic speeches. About a month after the hearing, my parents asked if I would come over for Sunday dinner. The invitation seemed simple enough, but I knew it represented something much larger. For 4 years, I had attended family gatherings feeling like an outsider sitting at my own table. This would be the first dinner since everything had changed. As I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, I noticed my father waiting on the front porch. He walked down the steps before I even reached the front door. "I am glad you came," he said warmly. "So am I replied honestly. Inside the house, everything looked familiar. The framed family photographs still lined the hallway. My mother's favorite blue serving dishes sat neatly arranged on the dining room table. The smell of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and homemade rolls filled the kitchen exactly the way it had throughout my childhood. For a brief moment, I felt as though time had folded back on itself. Yet something important had changed. Nobody looked at me with uncertainty anymore. My father pulled out a chair beside his own place at the table instead of leaving me at the opposite end, as had quietly become the habit over the past several years. It was a small decision, but I noticed it immediately. During dinner, we talked about work, neighborhood updates, Sarah's new house, and my mother's plans for her garden. Not once did anyone treat me as though I needed to prove myself. Nobody watched my reactions or questioned my words. I was simply included. Halfway through the meal, my father gently set his fork down and looked around the table. "There is something I want to say," he began. Everyone grew quiet. He looked directly at my mother before speaking again. "For years, I believed that being a good father meant always having the right answers. What I finally learned is that being a good father sometimes means admitting you asked the wrong questions." He then turned toward me. "Nathan, I cannot change the years we lost. I cannot give you back birthdays, holidays, or conversations that should have happened. But I can promise that from this day forward, I will listen before I judge." The room remained silent for several moments. My mother reached over and gently squeezed his hand before looking at me. "Your father is not the only one who learned something," she said softly. I confused worry with wisdom. I thought I was protecting our family, but fear made me trust rumors more than the son I raised. I will always regret that. I looked at both of them and realized they were no longer speaking because they felt obligated to apologize. They were speaking because they genuinely understood the mistake they had made. That difference mattered. "Thank you," I answered quietly. "That is all I ever wanted. Not perfection, just honesty." The conversation gradually returned to lighter subjects, but the atmosphere around the table felt completely different than it had for years. We laughed about old family vacations. Sarah reminded everyone about the time our father accidentally burned hamburgers during a neighborhood cookout and insisted they tasted perfectly fine anyway. My mother rolled her eyes while laughing so hard she had to wipe away tears. I found myself laughing with them, not because the past had disappeared, but because I finally felt safe enough to enjoy the present. Before leaving that evening, my father walked with me to my truck. The sun had almost disappeared beyond the trees, casting long shadows across the driveway where he had once watched me learn to ride a bicycle. He stood quietly beside the driver's door before speaking. "You know," he said with a thoughtful smile, "for years I kept thinking about the day you moved away. I remembered telling you that whenever you were ready to tell us the truth, you knew where to find us." He paused before lowering his eyes. "I finally understand that you were already telling us the truth. We simply were not ready to hear it." I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "We cannot rewrite that day," I said, "but we can decide what tomorrow looks like." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had become an adult, he pulled me into a quiet embrace that carried no expectations, no disappointment, and no doubt. As I drove home that evening, I realized something I had never fully understood before. Sometimes families are not healed by extraordinary moments. Sometimes they are rebuilt one honest conversation, one shared meal, and one fulfilled promise at a time. By the time autumn arrived, our family had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new. We no longer measured our conversations by what had happened in the courtroom. Instead, we measured them by ordinary moments that slowly restored the trust we had almost lost forever. Every Sunday dinner became less about repairing old wounds and more about creating new memories. My father called before each gathering to ask whether there was anything I wanted my mother to cook, and every time I laughed because she always made enough food for twice the number of people who actually came. Those evenings reminded me that families are rarely rebuilt through dramatic speeches. They are rebuilt through consistent acts of care repeated week after week. One Friday afternoon, my father called and asked if I had time to meet him at the hardware store. He wanted to replace the old fence behind my parents' house before winter arrived. Years earlier, we would have spent an entire weekend working side by side, without saying much, because we understood each other without needing many words. After everything that had happened, I wondered whether that quiet comfort could ever return. I arrived just after lunch and found him studying different types of cedar boards. He smiled when he saw me. "I figured you would know which ones will last the longest," he said. I laughed. "You are still asking me for advice?" He nodded. "I should have started doing that a long time ago." We spent the rest of the afternoon measuring posts, carrying lumber, and talking about everything except the past. He asked about a transportation project I had recently completed at work. I asked about his retirement plans. We debated the best football teams, complained about rising grocery prices, and joked about how neither of us seemed as strong as we had been 20 years earlier. At one point, he quietly looked over at me and smiled. "I missed this," he admitted. "So did I answered. There was nothing else that needed to be said. A few weeks later, our extended family gathered for my aunt's 70th birthday celebration. It was the first large family event since the court proceedings had ended. As I walked into the community hall, several relatives greeted me warmly. Some had quietly supported me over the years. Others had believed the same rumors that influenced my parents. I did not know what to expect. During dinner, my uncle stood to offer a toast celebrating my aunt's birthday. After everyone applauded, my father slowly rose from his chair. I assumed he wanted to add another birthday wish, but instead he looked around the room with unusual seriousness. "Before we continue," he said, "there is something I need to say to everyone here." The room became completely quiet. He rested one hand on the back of his chair before continuing. "Many of you know that our family went through a very difficult period over the past several years. Most of you also know that the court recently completed its review." He paused briefly before looking directly at me. "I spent years believing my son was wrong. I believed stories before I believed him. I convinced myself I was being responsible when in reality I was failing at the most important responsibility a father has. I failed to listen. Nobody interrupted him. The court corrected the record, he continued. But I want to correct something else. If I ever repeated anything that caused any of you to doubt Nathan's character, I was wrong, and I am sorry. He deserved my trust long before he received my apology. The room remained silent for another few seconds before my uncle slowly nodded with quiet respect. Several relatives looked toward me with expressions that carried understanding instead of curiosity. No dramatic applause followed. There did not need to be any. My father's willingness to admit his mistake publicly carried more weight than any celebration ever could. After dinner, several family members approached me individually. Some simply shook my hand. Others quietly apologized for believing things they had never personally verified. I accepted every apology with gratitude because I understood something they were only beginning to learn. Most people are not intentionally unkind. They simply become too comfortable accepting easy explanations instead of asking difficult questions. As the evening came to an end, my mother walked beside me toward the parking lot. The cool autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves while children played near the entrance with balloons left over from the celebration. She looked at me with a gentle smile. "Your father has been thinking about that speech for weeks," she admitted. "He rewrote it at least a dozen times." I smiled. I could tell. She laughed softly. "He kept saying that if he was going to admit he had been wrong, he wanted everyone to hear it clearly because everyone had heard him when he believed he was right." We stood together for a quiet moment before she continued. "You know, Nathan, I used to believe that admitting mistakes made people look weak. Watching your father tonight reminded me that sometimes it is exactly the opposite." I nodded in agreement. "It takes confidence to defend your opinion. It takes character to correct it." She gently squeezed my arm before giving me one of the warmest hugs she had given me in years. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how different my life had become in just a few months. Nothing could erase the loneliness of those 4 difficult years, but those years no longer controlled the future. My parents had stopped trying to erase the past and had started accepting responsibility for it instead. That simple change allowed all of us to move forward together. For the first time in a very long while, our family was no longer held together by appearances or assumptions. We were held together by something much stronger, the willingness to tell the truth, to listen with humility, and to choose one another again every single day. Nearly a year has passed since the court closed the final chapter of my case. And if there is one lesson I carry with me every single day, it is that truth does not always arrive when we expect it, but when it does, it quietly changes everything around it. Life eventually returned to something that looked ordinary from the outside, yet I noticed countless small differences that reminded me how far our family had come. Sunday dinners became a tradition again instead of an obligation. My father no longer called only when he needed something. Sometimes he simply wanted to tell me about a book he had finished reading or ask whether I planned to watch the football game that weekend. My mother still insisted on sending leftovers home with me after every family meal, even though I repeatedly told her she packed enough food to feed an entire neighborhood. Sarah and I spoke regularly, sharing updates about work, home projects, and the ordinary moments that families often take for granted until they almost lose them. Those conversations were simple, but they were built on something we had not shared for years. They were built on trust. One crisp Saturday morning, my father invited me to join him for a fishing trip at the same lake where he had taken me when I was a boy. We loaded his truck before sunrise, stopping at the same small diner along the highway for breakfast before continuing toward the water. As we sat quietly in the boat watching the morning mist slowly lift from the lake, neither of us felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. After casting his fishing line, my father looked across the water for a long time before speaking. "You know," he said quietly, "I have replayed those years in my mind more times than I can count." I looked toward him without interrupting. "The strange thing is," he continued, "I always believed I was making decisions based on facts. Now I understand that I accepted conclusions before I truly examined the facts. I confused confidence with certainty." I smiled gently. "Most people do at some point." He slowly nodded. "Maybe, but not everyone gets another chance to make it right." I watched the sunlight reflecting across the calm water before answering. "The important part is that you used your second chance." He looked at me with a grateful smile that needed no further explanation. Later that afternoon, as we packed our equipment into the truck, he placed one hand on my shoulder and quietly said, something I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. Nathan, I used to think the proudest moment of my life would be watching my son succeed. I was wrong. The proudest moment was watching my son remain honest even after the people who loved him doubted him. I did not know how to answer immediately because no speech could ever equal the sincerity of those words. I simply hugged him, and for both of us, that was enough. A few months later, our family gathered once again for Thanksgiving. The house was filled with familiar laughter, warm food, and the comfortable noise that only large family gatherings seemed to create. At one point during the afternoon, I stepped outside onto the back porch to enjoy a few quiet minutes alone. My mother joined me carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me before looking out across the backyard where my father and Sarah were laughing together while raking leaves into large piles. They look happy, she said softly. They do, I answered. She remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. There is something I have wanted to tell you for a long time. I turned toward her. Go ahead. She smiled gently. For years I believed being a parent meant always protecting my children from difficult truths. What I finally learned is that sometimes being a parent means protecting your children from your own assumptions. I thought about those words carefully before replying. We all believed we were protecting something. The difference is that now we know trust deserves protection too. She reached over and squeezed my hand before we returned inside together. Looking back now, I no longer measure my life by the years that were lost. I measure it by what those years taught every one of us. They taught my father that listening is often more important than speaking. They taught my mother that love without trust leaves families fragile. They taught my sister that loyalty should never replace independent thought. And they taught me that bitterness can become another kind of prison if we refuse to let it go. The court restored my reputation, but forgiveness restored my family. Those were 2 completely different victories, and I needed both before I could truly move forward. Sometimes people ask whether I wish those painful years had never happened. The honest answer is that I wish my parents had believed me from the very beginning. I wish we had never spent birthdays, holidays, and ordinary afternoons separated by doubt. But wishing cannot rewrite history. What it can do is remind us to live differently tomorrow than we did yesterday. Today, whenever my father calls my name across the backyard or my mother saves my favorite seat at the dinner table, I no longer hear guilt in their voices. I hear acceptance. I hear respect. Most importantly, I hear the quiet confidence of a family that finally learned the difference between assuming someone is wrong and taking the time to hear them completely. The truth did not simply change a court record. It changed the way we spoke to one another, the way we listened to one another, and the way we chose to love one another. In the end, I discovered that the greatest proof of all was never written inside legal documents or spoken from the bench of a courtroom. It was written every day afterward in the ordinary decisions our family made to trust before judging, to listen before concluding, and to stand beside one another with the understanding that sometimes the strongest families are not the ones that never make mistakes, but the ones willing to admit them, learn from them, and begin again together.